In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal history echo through marble corridors, a single moment of vulnerability would reveal the raw humanity behind the crown. When the cameras weren't rolling and the world wasn't watching, Catherine and William faced a goodbye that would test the very foundation of their relationship. This isn't just another royal story about duty and protocol. This is about two people who found themselves at the crossroads of love and obligation, where words became inadequate and silence spoke volumes. What happened in those final moments before duty called them apart would later be described by palace insiders as the most genuine display of emotion they had ever witnessed from the future king and queen. The tears that fell that day weren't just drops of sadness. They were the crystallization of a love story that had weathered public scrutiny, family pressure, and the weight of an entire nation's expectations. This is the untold story of how a goodbye without words became the most powerful declaration of love the royal family had ever seen. It's about the moments that define us, the silences that say everything, and the tears that sometimes speak louder than any speech from the throne. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished floors where Catherine walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the unusual quiet. It was March 15th, and everything felt different. The palace staff moved with hushed urgency, preparing for what everyone knew would be one of the most difficult days in recent royal history. William stood in his private study, staring at the official documents spread across his mahogany desk. The papers detailed his upcoming deployment to the Falkland Islands as a Royal Air Force search and rescue pilot, a 6-week mission that would take him 8,000 miles away from everything familiar, everything he loved. The deployment had been planned for months, but now that the day had arrived, the reality felt overwhelming. Catherine had known this day would come ever since William received his posting orders. She had prepared herself mentally, or so she thought. She had practiced her supportive smile in the mirror, rehearsed encouraging words, and even planned activities to keep herself busy during his absence. But, as she watched him from the doorway of his study, she realized that no amount of preparation could have readied her for the actual goodbye. The couple had been married for 2 years, but their relationship had been tested by duty before. William's military commitments had always been a part of their lives, creating a unique rhythm of hellos and goodbyes that other couples didn't have to navigate. But this deployment was different. The Falkland Islands held special significance for the royal family. Prince Andrew had served there during the war in 1982, and the posting carried both honor and genuine danger. Palace insiders later revealed that Catherine had spent the previous night walking the halls of Kensington Palace, unable to sleep. She had found herself in the portrait gallery, standing before paintings of queens who had faced similar separations from their husbands. Queen Victoria had endured long separations from Prince Albert during his travels. Queen Elizabeth had watched Prince Philip leave for naval duties countless times. Catherine drew strength from their stories, but it didn't make her own situation easier. William, meanwhile, had been dealing with his own emotional turmoil. Friends close to the prince described him as unusually quiet in the weeks leading up to the deployment. He had thrown himself into preparation, studying maps of the South Atlantic, reviewing emergency procedures, and ensuring every detail was perfect. It was his way of coping, but those who knew him well recognized it as a defense mechanism against the pain of leaving Catherine. The morning routine at Kensington Palace proceeded as usual, but there was an underlying tension that everyone could feel. The household staff, who had grown fond of the young couple, moved through their duties with heavy hearts. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, later recalled that she had never seen the palace feel so somber during peacetime. Catherine had requested breakfast in the private dining room, something she rarely did. Usually, she preferred the kitchen, chatting with staff, and maintaining the informal atmosphere that had become her trademark. But today, she needed privacy. She needed space to process what was happening and to spend these final hours with William away from prying eyes. As they sat across from each other at the small breakfast table, neither of them ate much. The usual morning conversation about the day's schedule and upcoming events felt hollow. Instead, they found themselves talking about small things, memories from their university days at St. Andrews, plans for when William returned, silly jokes that made them both laugh despite the circumstances. William reached across the table and took Catherine's hand. Her fingers were cold, he noticed, and slightly trembling. She was trying so hard to be strong, to be the supportive wife that everyone expected her to be. But William could see through the facade. He had known her long enough to recognize the signs. The way she bit her lower lip when she was nervous, the way she played with her wedding ring when she was thinking, the way her eyes grew bright when she was fighting back tears. The palace had arranged for a private car to take William to the airport. No media would be present. This was a personal moment, not a public event. But even in the absence of cameras and reporters, both Catherine and William felt the weight of their roles. They were not just husband and wife saying goodbye. They were the future king and queen of England, and their relationship was a matter of national interest. Catherine had chosen her outfit carefully for this day. She wore a simple navy dress that William had always said he loved, paired with the sapphire earrings he had given her for their first wedding anniversary. She wanted to look beautiful for him, wanted him to carry a perfect image of her in his memory during the long weeks ahead. But, more than that, she wanted to feel like herself, not the Duchess of Cambridge, not a public figure, just Kate, the woman who had fallen in love with a young man at university and was now watching him leave for duty. The couple had received advice from senior royals about handling military separations. Prince Philip had spoken to William about the importance of duty and service, while Queen Elizabeth had offered Catherine words of comfort about the strength that comes from supporting one's husband in service to the country. But all the advice in the world couldn't prepare them for the emotional reality of goodbye. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the palace grew increasingly heavy. The usual sounds of daily life, phones ringing, staff conversations, the distant hum of London traffic, seemed muted. Even the palace dogs, Lupo included, seemed to sense that something significant was happening. They stayed close to Catherine and William, as if understanding that their presence provided comfort. William had spent the previous evening writing letters, one for Catherine to open each week he was away, and others for special occasions that might arise during his deployment. He had hidden them throughout their private quarters, in places where Catherine would discover them naturally. One in her jewelry box, another tucked into her favorite book, one in the pocket of the coat she wore for their morning walks. It was his way of ensuring that even though he would be physically absent, his love would remain present in their daily life. Catherine, for her part, had prepared her own surprise. She had commissioned a small locket with their wedding photo inside, not the official portrait that had been published worldwide, but a candid shot taken moments after the ceremony, when they thought no one was looking. In the image, they were laughing at something William had whispered in her ear, and their joy was radiant and unguarded. She planned to give it to him just before he left, something he could carry with him during his deployment. The time for departure was approaching, and both of them could feel it. The driver had arrived and was waiting discreetly in the courtyard. William's luggage had been loaded, 2 large duffel bags containing everything he would need for 6 weeks in one of the world's most remote locations. The practicality of it all seemed to emphasize the reality of the separation. As they stood together in their private sitting room, surrounded by the familiar objects that made this place home, photographs from their travels, books they had read together, the comfortable furniture they had chosen together, the magnitude of the moment began to settle over them. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was the end of a chapter and the beginning of a test that would challenge everything they had built together. Catherine looked at William, memorizing every detail of his face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was relaxed. She wanted to remember everything perfectly, wanted to be able to close her eyes during the weeks ahead and see him clearly. William was doing the same thing, studying Catherine's face as if he were seeing it for the first time. The woman standing before him had transformed from the shy student he had met at university into a confident, graceful duchess. But, in this moment, she was simply the woman he loved, and the thought of leaving her felt almost unbearable. The silence between them grew heavy with unspoken words. There were things they both wanted to say, declarations of love and promises of faithfulness, words of encouragement and expressions of fear. But, somehow, in the face of such overwhelming emotion, language felt inadequate. How do you summarize years of love and companionship in a few parting words? How do you express the depth of feeling that exists between two people who have shared everything? As the moment of departure drew nearer, both Catherine and William realized that perhaps some goodbyes are too profound for words, that sometimes the most honest communication happens in the spaces between sentences, in the look that passes between two people who understand each other completely. They were about to discover that love, in its purest form, doesn't always need a voice to be heard. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed 11 times, each note seeming to echo through the silence that had settled over Kensington Palace. William glanced at his watch and then at Catherine, and they both understood without words that the time had come. The car was waiting, the driver was ready, and duty was calling. But neither of them moved toward the door. Instead, they found themselves drawn to each other with an intensity that surprised them both. William reached up and gently touched Catherine's face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. She closed her eyes at his touch, leaning into his palm as if she could memorize the feeling of his hands on her skin. When she opened her eyes again, he saw something there that made his breath catch, not just love, but a fierce determination that spoke of the woman who had chosen to marry into this life, knowing full well what it would demand of her. Catherine had spent months preparing for this deployment, but not in the way most military wives prepare. She had studied maps of the Falkland Islands, learning about the weather patterns and the challenges William would face as a search and rescue pilot. She had spoken quietly with other military spouses, learning about their coping strategies and the way they maintained connection across vast distances. She had even practiced meditation, hoping to find inner peace that would sustain her through the lonely weeks ahead. But all of that preparation paled in comparison to what she was feeling now. This wasn't about strategy or coping mechanisms. This was about the raw reality of watching the man she loved walk away into danger, knowing that she couldn't protect him or share in whatever challenges he would face. The independence and strength she had cultivated throughout her life suddenly felt inadequate against the vulnerability of love. William was struggling with his own complex emotions. As a pilot, he was trained to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission ahead rather than dwelling on what he was leaving behind. But Catherine had always been his anchor, the person who kept him grounded in the midst of royal duties and public pressure. The thought of facing the isolation of the Falklands without her support felt daunting in a way that no amount of training had prepared him for. The couple had always communicated as much through touch as through words. In public, royal protocol limited their physical contact to brief, appropriate gestures. But, in private, they had developed their own language of affection. The way William would place his hand on the small of Catherine's back when guiding her through a room, the way she would straighten his tie before important meetings, the way they would brush hands when passing each other in their daily routines. Now, standing in their sitting room with departure imminent, they seemed to be having an entire conversation through touch alone. The deployment to the Falklands represented both aspects of his character. It was a duty, yes, but it was also something he genuinely wanted to do. William had always been drawn to search and rescue work, finding meaning in the direct, tangible way he could help people in crisis. Catherine understood this about him and had never tried to discourage his military service, even when it meant personal sacrifice for both of them. The palace staff had become experts at reading the moods of the royal family, and today they moved through their duties with unusual sensitivity. Margaret, the head housekeeper, had quietly arranged for fresh flowers throughout the couple's private quarters, Catherine's favorite white roses, arranged simply in small vases that would remind her of William's thoughtfulness in the days to come. The kitchen staff had prepared William's favorite meals for the days leading up to departure, and his Batman had ensured that every detail of his military kit was perfect. But all of these gestures, though appreciated, felt small against the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about missing each other's company or adjusting daily routines. This was about maintaining emotional connection across an ocean, about sustaining love through satellite phone calls and delayed emails, about trusting that their bond was strong enough to weather the challenges of separation. William had received extensive briefings about his upcoming deployment, but the military had also provided guidance about maintaining family relationships during extended overseas service. The advice was practical. Establish regular communication schedules, be mindful of time differences, share daily experiences even when they seem mundane. But William knew that his situation was unique. Regular military families didn't have to worry about media attention or public scrutiny of their personal relationships. The couple had made practical arrangements for Catherine's life during William's absence. She would maintain her royal duties, of course, but friends and family had also planned visits and activities to help fill the time. Her sister Pippa had cleared her schedule to spend more time at Kensington Palace, and her parents had arranged to visit more frequently. The Queen had even suggested that Catherine might enjoy spending time at Balmoral, where the peace and privacy might provide comfort during difficult moments. But beyond the practical arrangements, There were deeper preparations that couldn't be scheduled or organized. Catherine had been working on building emotional resilience, drawing on the strength she had developed during the intense media scrutiny of her relationship with William. She had learned to find peace in solitude, to maintain her sense of self even when surrounded by the demands and expectations of royal life. William, too, had been preparing emotionally for the separation. He had spoken with his father about the challenges of duty versus family, drawing on Prince Charles's experience of balancing royal obligations with personal relationships. He had also spent time with veterans who understood the unique pressures of military service, learning from their experiences of maintaining marriages and families despite the demands of deployment. The clock continued its steady ticking, marking the passage of time that seemed both too fast and too slow. Each minute brought them closer to goodbye, but each minute was also precious, a final opportunity to be together before the separation began. They found themselves paying attention to the smallest details, the way the afternoon light fell across Catherine's face, the sound of William's laughter at a shared memory, the familiar comfort of being in the same room with the person who understood them completely. Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket she had commissioned. Without saying anything, she fastened it around William's neck, her fingers gentle against his skin as she worked the clasp. When she stepped back, he looked down at the small piece of jewelry and then back at her, understanding immediately what it represented. He didn't open it. That would come later, perhaps during a difficult moment when he needed to remember why he was serving, why their sacrifice mattered. William, in turn, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple silver bracelet, engraved with coordinates, not of any famous or significant place, but of the exact spot where they had first kissed as students at St. Andrews. It was his way of reminding Catherine that no matter how far apart they were physically, they would always be connected to the place where their love story began. The exchange of gifts happened without fanfare or ceremony, but the gesture carried profound meaning for both of them. These weren't just keepsakes or tokens of affection. They were tangible reminders of their connection, objects that would carry emotional weight during the weeks of separation ahead. As they held each other, both Catherine and William found themselves thinking about the future. This deployment would end, William would return, and their life together would resume. But they both understood that they would be changed by this experience. Catherine would discover new depths of her own strength and independence, while William would gain a deeper appreciation for what they had built together. The separation would be difficult, but it would also be a test that would ultimately strengthen their bond. The sound of a gentle knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. It was time. The driver was ready, the schedule had to be maintained, and duty was calling. But as they looked at each other, preparing for the moment they had both been dreading, they realized that something profound had already happened. In these final minutes together, surrounded by silence and filled with unspoken emotion, they had communicated more deeply than ever before. William took Catherine's hands one final time, raising them to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Catherine closed her eyes, memorizing the feeling, knowing it would have to sustain her through the weeks ahead. When she opened her eyes, she saw that William's were bright with unshed tears, and she realized that her own eyes were doing the same. The goodbye was approaching, but they had already said everything that needed to be said. Not with words, but with touch, with shared glances, with the quiet understanding that passes between two people whose love has been tested and proven strong. The tears that were gathering in their eyes weren't just expressions of sadness. They were acknowledgments of the depth of what they shared, and the strength it would take to let each other go. The second knock came more insistently, followed by a soft voice from the corridor. "Your Royal Highness, the car is ready." It was James, William's private secretary, speaking with the careful deference that marked all interactions with the royal family. But there was also an understanding in his tone. He had worked with William long enough to recognize the significance of this moment, and his voice carried the gentle urgency of someone who understood the difficulty of what was being asked. William and Catherine stepped apart slowly, as if movement itself might shatter the protective bubble of intimacy they had created around themselves. The real world was calling them back, reminding them that beyond these walls, beyond this moment, there were responsibilities and expectations that couldn't be ignored, no matter how much they might wish otherwise. Catherine smoothed William's uniform with hands that trembled slightly, a gesture that was both practical and deeply personal. The Royal Air Force blue looked striking against his complexion, and the wings on his chest represented not just his qualifications as a pilot, but his dedication to service. She had always been proud of his commitment to his military career, understanding that it represented something essential about who he was as a man, separate from his role as a future king. The uniform also reminded her of the dangers he would face. Search and rescue operations were inherently risky, and the remote location of the Falkland Islands added additional challenges. Weather conditions could change rapidly in the South Atlantic, and the nearest backup was hundreds of miles away. These thoughts had haunted her during sleepless nights in recent weeks, but she pushed them aside now, focusing instead on the pride she felt in his service. William looked down at Catherine, taking in every detail of her appearance as if he were creating a photograph in his mind. The navy dress she had chosen was simple but elegant, and he recognized it as one she had worn during their early days of marriage, during happier, less complicated times. The sapphire earrings caught the afternoon light, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked strong, and he drew comfort from that strength. They walked together toward the door, their steps synchronized in a way that spoke of years of walking together through royal events, state occasions, and private moments. But today, each step felt weighted with significance. They were walking toward goodbye, toward separation, toward a test of their relationship that neither of them had fully prepared for. The corridor that led to the main entrance of Kensington Palace stretched before them, lined with portraits of previous royal couples who had faced their own challenges and separations. Catherine found herself thinking about Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, who had navigated decades of royal duty while maintaining their marriage. Their example provided some comfort, but it also highlighted the unique pressures that came with royal life. Palace staff lined the corridor discreetly, wanting to show their support without intruding on the private moment. Margaret, the head housekeeper, gave Catherine an encouraging nod. Charles, the head of security who would accompany William to the airport, stood ready with quiet professionalism. Even Lupo, their cocker spaniel, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, staying close to Catherine's side rather than bounding ahead as he usually would. As they reached the main entrance, Catherine felt her composure beginning to waver. The sight of the waiting car made everything real in a way that all their preparation hadn't. This black vehicle would take William away from her, would carry him to the airport, and then to a place so far away that she couldn't even imagine it clearly. The practical arrangements they had made for communication, scheduled phone calls, email updates, care packages, suddenly felt inadequate against the reality of his absence. William sensed her struggle and paused, turning to face her fully. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and the weight of everything they couldn't say seemed to hang in the air between them. The palace entrance, with its formal grandeur and historical significance, felt like an inappropriate backdrop for such an intimate moment, but it was also fitting in its own way. Their entire relationship had played out against this backdrop of duty and service, and this goodbye was just another scene in that larger story. The driver stepped out of the car and moved to open the door, but William raised a hand slightly, indicating that he needed a few more moments. The man nodded and stepped back, understanding that some things couldn't be rushed, regardless of schedules or protocol. This small gesture of human understanding in the midst of formal procedure seemed to give both William and Catherine permission to take the time they needed. Catherine reached up and straightened William's collar one final time, her fingers lingering against the fabric. It was such a small, domestic gesture, but it felt enormously significant in that moment. She was caring for him, preparing him for his journey, showing her love in the way she always had, through small, attentive actions that spoke of deep affection and concern. William captured her hand as she finished with his collar, holding it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. It was strong and steady, despite the emotion of the moment, and Catherine drew comfort from that rhythm. It reminded her that he was strong, that he was trained for this mission, that he would take care of himself because he had something precious to come home to. The first tear fell then, rolling down Catherine's cheek before she could stop it. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, had wanted to be strong for William's sake, but the combination of love and fear and pride was overwhelming. The tears seemed to break something open in both of them, and suddenly, the careful composure they had maintained began to crumble. William's own eyes filled as he watched Catherine struggle with her emotions. He reached up and gently brushed the tear away with his thumb, his touch soft against her skin. But, even as he comforted her, his own tears began to fall. They had both tried so hard to be strong, to handle this goodbye with dignity and courage. But the reality was that love made them vulnerable in ways that no amount of training or preparation could address. The sight of William's tears undid Catherine completely. She had seen him emotional before, at their wedding, during difficult moments with his family, when discussing his mother's memory. But there was something about his tears in this moment that spoke to the depth of what they were facing together. He wasn't just sad about leaving. He was acknowledging the courage it took for both of them to let each other go. They came together in an embrace that felt different from any they had shared before. It wasn't the careful, public affection they showed at royal events, or even the relaxed intimacy of their private moments. This embrace was desperate and clinging, an attempt to hold on to each other against the forces that were pulling them apart. Catherine buried her face against William's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the crisp smell of his uniform. William held her tightly, one hand pressed against the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist. He could feel her tears soaking through his uniform, and his own tears fell into her hair. They stood there, holding each other and crying, and somehow the tears felt like a release rather than a breakdown. They were finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of what this separation meant to them. Palace staff, who had witnessed many royal departures over the years, later said they had never seen such raw emotion from members of the family. But, rather than being embarrassed or uncomfortable, they felt honored to witness such genuine love. In a world where royal relationships were often scrutinized and analyzed, this moment of pure human emotion reminded everyone present that beneath the titles and duties, William and Catherine were simply two people who loved each other deeply. The embrace lasted several minutes, neither of them wanting to be the first to let go. But, gradually, they both became aware that the moment couldn't last forever, that the car was waiting and schedules had to be maintained. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to separate, though they kept their hands linked as they looked at each other. Catherine's makeup was smudged from crying, and William's uniform showed the evidence of her tears, but neither of them cared about appearances in that moment. They had moved beyond pretense into something more honest and real than any public appearance or formal portrait could capture. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, gently dabbing at Catherine's eyes and cheeks. The gesture was tender and intimate, and it made her smile through her tears. He had always taken care of her in small ways like this, and the familiarity of his attention was comforting even in the midst of goodbye. As he finished cleaning her face, Catherine did the same for him, using a tissue from her purse to carefully wipe away his tears. They were taking care of each other, preparing each other to face the world again after this moment of vulnerability. It was a dance of mutual care that spoke to the partnership they had built together. The driver cleared his throat softly, a gentle reminder that time was running short. William nodded, understanding that the moment they had been dreading could no longer be postponed. But, as he prepared to walk toward the car, he realized that something fundamental had shifted during their tearful embrace. The goodbye was still happening, the separation was still real, but they had moved through the most difficult part together. Looking into Catherine's eyes, William saw not just sadness, but also strength. She was going to be all right during his absence, not because the separation wouldn't be difficult, but because she had the inner resources to handle whatever came. And Catherine, looking back at him, saw the same resilience and determination that had drawn her to him in the first place. They had cried together, had acknowledged their fear and sadness, had allowed themselves to be completely vulnerable with each other. And, in doing so, they had discovered that their love was strong enough to encompass not just joy and happiness, but also grief and fear and the courage to let each other go when duty demanded it. With tears dried and composure regained, William and Catherine found themselves in a space that felt suspended between their private grief and the public duty that awaited. The car door stood open like a portal to an uncertain future, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard. Everything about the moment felt heightened and significant, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the importance of what was happening. Catherine had always possessed a remarkable ability to transform herself when circumstances demanded it. In the space of a few moments, she shifted from the vulnerable woman who had wept in her husband's arms to the composed duchess who would need to face the world in his absence. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and found within herself the poise that had carried her through countless royal engagements. But this transformation wasn't a rejection of her earlier vulnerability. It was an integration of strength and tenderness that made her formidable. William watched this transformation with admiration and love. He had witnessed Catherine's evolution from the shy university student he had first met to the confident woman who now stood beside him, and he never ceased to be amazed by her resilience. She had faced intense media scrutiny, family pressures, and the overwhelming responsibility of representing the monarchy, and she had met each challenge with grace and determination. The staff members who had gathered to see William off maintained their respectful distance, but their presence added a layer of ceremony to the departure that neither William nor Catherine had anticipated. These were people who had served the royal family for decades, who understood the weight of duty and sacrifice that came with royal life. Their silent support created a circle of understanding around the couple's goodbye. Margaret, the head housekeeper, stepped forward briefly to hand Catherine a small envelope. "For later, ma'am," she said quietly, and Catherine understood immediately that it was a message of support from the staff, something to comfort her during the difficult first days of William's absence. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply, reminding her that she wasn't facing this separation alone. William turned to address the small gathering of staff members, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "Thank you all for everything you've done to prepare for this deployment," he said. "Please take good care of the Duchess while I'm away." His words were formal, but the underlying message was clear. Catherine would need their support, and he was entrusting her well-being to their care. The security team had been briefing William throughout the morning about the logistics of his departure and deployment, but now they stood ready with quiet professionalism, understanding that their role was to facilitate this goodbye rather than rush it. Charles, the head of security, had worked with the royal family long enough to know that some moments required patience, regardless of schedules or security protocols. Catherine found herself thinking about the wives of other military personnel who faced similar goodbyes regularly, often without the support system and resources that surrounded her. Her situation was unique in many ways, but the fundamental experience of watching a beloved husband leave for dangerous duty was something she shared with countless women around the world. This thought gave her strength and perspective, reminding her that love often requires sacrifice. The couple had talked extensively about how they would handle the actual moment of departure. They had considered various approaches: a quick, efficient goodbye that would minimize the pain, or a more extended farewell that would give them time to say everything they wanted to say. In the end, they had decided to let the moment unfold naturally, to trust their instincts and their love to guide them through it. Standing beside the car, they found themselves in that natural flow they had hoped for. There were no more tears now, but there was a deep sense of connection that seemed to make words unnecessary. They had moved beyond the need to verbalize their love or their fears. Everything important had already been communicated through their earlier embrace, their tears, their silent understanding of what this separation would mean for both of them. William reached for Catherine's hands one final time, holding them gently as he looked into her eyes. "I love you," he said simply, and the words carried the weight of everything he couldn't say: his gratitude for her support, his promise to return safely, his acknowledgement of the courage she was showing in letting him go. "I love you too," Catherine replied, and her voice was steady and clear. In those 4 words, she conveyed her own unspoken messages: her pride in his service, her commitment to waiting for him, her faith in their ability to weather this separation together. The exchange was witnessed by everyone present, but it felt completely private, as if they were alone in the world. This was the power of their connection. It created a space of intimacy even in public settings, allowing them to communicate authentically regardless of who might be watching. William released Catherine's hands and stepped toward the car, but then paused and turned back to her. For a moment, it seemed as if he might say something more, might try to find additional words to mark this significant moment. But instead, he simply nodded slightly, and Catherine nodded back, and in that silent exchange they acknowledged everything that couldn't be spoken. The palace photographer, who had been standing discreetly nearby, captured this moment, not for public release, but for the couple's private collection. Years later, this photograph would become one of their most treasured possessions, not because it was technically perfect, but because it captured the authentic emotion and connection between them at one of the most challenging moments of their marriage. As William settled into the car, Catherine stepped back, but remained visible through the window. She placed her hand against the glass, and William mirrored the gesture from inside the vehicle. For several seconds, they maintained this connection, palm to palm with only the car window between them. It was a moment of profound intimacy that spoke to their ability to find each other even in the midst of separation. The driver started the engine, and the sound seemed to break the spell that had held everyone in suspended animation. This was really happening. The goodbye was complete, and now came the actual leaving. Catherine stepped back further, giving the car room to maneuver, but her eyes never left William's face as he looked back at her through the rear window. As the car began to move slowly through the palace gates, Catherine walked alongside it for a few steps, maintaining visual contact with William for as long as possible. The gesture was unconscious and natural, the instinctive response of someone trying to extend a precious moment for just a little longer. When she could no longer keep pace with the vehicle, she stopped and watched as it disappeared around the corner, carrying away the most important person in her world. The silence that followed the car's departure was profound. The staff members began to disperse quietly, returning to their duties with the understanding that Catherine might need some time alone. Margaret lingered briefly, ready to provide support if needed, but Catherine gave her a small nod that indicated she was managing well, that she could handle this first moment of alone. Standing in the palace courtyard, Catherine felt the full weight of William's absence settle over her. The space that had been filled with his presence just moments before now felt empty and strange. But rather than being overwhelmed by the emptiness, she found herself focusing on the fullness of what they had just shared. The goodbye had been difficult, but it had also been beautiful in its honesty and depth. Catherine reached up and touched the spot where William's hand had rested on her face, as if she could still feel the warmth of his touch. The memory of their final embrace was still vivid, and she drew strength from the knowledge that their connection was strong enough to survive physical separation. They had weathered challenges before, and they would weather this one too. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting everything in a golden light that made the moment feel even more significant. Catherine looked up at their apartment windows, at the home they had created together, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for what they had built. This deployment would be difficult, but it would not break them. If anything, it would prove the strength of their bond and their commitment to each other. As she turned to walk back into the palace, Catherine felt a quiet determination settling over her. She would miss William terribly, would worry about his safety, would count the days until his return. But she would also use this time to grow, to strengthen herself, to become even more worthy of the love they shared. The goodbye had been painful, but it had also been a beginning, the start of a new chapter in their story, one that would test them but ultimately make them stronger. The tears had been necessary, the embrace had been healing, and the silent understanding they had shared would sustain them through the weeks ahead. They had said goodbye without words because their love was beyond language, deeper than speech, stronger than the forces that would temporarily separate them. In choosing duty over comfort, service over safety, they had proven that their relationship could encompass not just personal happiness, but also sacrifice for something greater than themselves. The weeks that followed William's departure became a testament to the strength that Catherine had discovered within herself during those final moments at the palace. The first night alone in their private quarters was the hardest. The silence felt oppressive, and every familiar object seemed to remind her of his absence. But as the days passed, she began to understand that missing someone deeply was not a weakness, but rather a reflection of how profoundly she was capable of loving. Catherine established new routines that honored both her independence and her connection to William. She would wake early and spend time in their private garden, often with Lupo at her side, reading the letters William had hidden throughout their quarters. Each discovery felt like receiving a gift, and his words provided comfort and encouragement exactly when she needed them most. His ability to anticipate her emotional needs, even from thousands of miles away, reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. The palace staff, who had witnessed the emotional goodbye, rallied around Catherine with discreet support. Margaret would leave fresh flowers in her sitting room each morning, always including a sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, as she quietly explained when Catherine asked. The kitchen staff prepared meals that accommodated her changing appetite during the stressful first weeks, and the security team adjusted their routines to provide additional comfort without being intrusive. Communication with William came through scheduled satellite phone calls that were precious but challenging. The time difference meant that Catherine often found herself awake in the middle of the night, waiting for his calls. The connection was sometimes poor, marked by delays and static that made conversation difficult, but hearing his voice was worth any technical frustration. They learned to communicate in new ways, speaking slowly to account for delays, sharing the small details of their daily lives that suddenly seemed enormously important. William, for his part, was discovering the particular challenges of serving in such a remote location while maintaining connection to home. The Falkland Islands were beautiful but austere, and the work was demanding and sometimes dangerous. During search and rescue missions, he would find his hand unconsciously touching the locket Catherine had given him, drawing strength from the physical reminder of their love. His fellow servicemen, who had their own experiences with separation from loved ones, provided camaraderie and understanding that helped sustain him through difficult days. The couple had agreed that Catherine would not visit during the deployment, understanding that such a trip would create enormous logistical challenges and media attention that would distract from William's service. But they found creative ways to share experiences across the distance. Catherine would photograph the sunrise from Kensington Palace and email it to William, who would respond with pictures of the dramatic Falklands landscape. These exchanges became a daily ritual that helped them feel connected despite the vast ocean between them. 3 weeks into the deployment, Catherine faced her first real crisis without William's physical support. News broke of a helicopter accident involving a military aircraft, and for several terrifying hours, she was unable to reach William to confirm his safety. The experience of not knowing, of facing the possibility of loss, was more frightening than anything she had previously imagined. When William's call finally came through, confirming that he had been nowhere near the incident, Catherine's relief was so profound that she found herself shaking. This scare became a turning point for Catherine, forcing her to confront the reality that military service always carries risks, that the man she loved was genuinely in danger every time he flew. Instead of being paralyzed by this knowledge, she found herself growing stronger, developing a kind of courage that came from fully accepting what she couldn't control while focusing intensely on what she could. Catherine began using her time alone to pursue interests and causes that mattered to her, throwing herself into charitable work with a focus and energy that surprised even her closest advisors. She visited hospitals and schools, spent time with military families facing their own separations, and began developing ideas for initiatives she wanted to launch when William returned. The work provided meaning and purpose during a time that could easily have been consumed by loneliness and worry. The media attention surrounding Catherine during William's deployment was intense, but generally respectful. Photos of her appearing composed and engaged at public events were accompanied by articles praising her grace under pressure. But what the public couldn't see were the private moments. The time she would pause during a busy day to read one of William's hidden letters, the way she would catch herself listening for his footsteps in their empty apartment, the dreams she had where he was home safe. Halfway through the deployment, Catherine received an unexpected package from William. Inside was a small stone he had found on a Falklands beach, along with a note explaining that he carried a similar stone from their favorite beach in Wales, where they had spent their honeymoon. The gesture was simple but profound, creating a physical connection between the two places that meant so much to them. Catherine began carrying the stone with her everywhere, often touching it during difficult moments as a reminder of their enduring bond. William's letters, both the ones he had hidden before departure and the new ones that arrived via military mail, revealed depths of emotion and reflection that their daily phone calls couldn't always capture. He wrote about the beauty and isolation of the Falklands, about the satisfaction of successful rescue missions, about his growing appreciation for the life they had built together. Reading his words, Catherine could hear his voice and feel his presence in ways that transcended physical distance. As the deployment entered its final weeks, both Catherine and William found themselves changed by the experience. Catherine had discovered reserves of strength and independence she hadn't known she possessed, while William had gained a new appreciation for the partnership they shared and the support Catherine provided in all aspects of his life. Their phone calls began to include plans for his return and discussions of how they wanted to integrate what they had learned during their separation. The anticipation of reunion brought its own challenges. Both had grown during their time apart, and there was some anxiety about how they would reconnect after such a significant separation. But There was also excitement and joy at the prospect of being together again, of sharing physical space and immediate communication after weeks of distance and delayed conversations. Catherine began preparing for William's return with the same attention to detail she had applied to his departure. She arranged for their favorite meals to be prepared, ensured that their apartment was filled with flowers, and even planned small surprises that would remind him how much she had missed him. But beyond the practical preparations, she was also preparing emotionally for the transition back to being a couple after functioning as an individual for so many weeks. The final phone call before William's departure from the Falklands was markedly different from their earlier conversations. Both could barely contain their excitement at the prospect of being reunited, but there was also a sense of completion about what they had accomplished during their separation. They had proven to themselves and each other that their love could survive significant challenges, that their commitment was strong enough to encompass not just joy but also sacrifice and separation. When the day of William's return finally arrived, Catherine found herself surprisingly nervous. She had dreamed of this moment for weeks, had planned every detail of their reunion, but now that it was actually happening, she felt almost shy about seeing him again. The woman who would greet him at the airport was not exactly the same person who had said goodbye 6 weeks earlier. She was stronger, more confident, more aware of her own capabilities. The reunion itself was everything Catherine had hoped for and more. When William emerged from the aircraft and saw her waiting, his face lit up with a joy that was visible from across the tarmac. Their embrace was passionate and desperate, making up for weeks of missed physical contact. But it was also different from their goodbye, where that farewell had been marked by tears and uncertainty. This reunion was characterized by celebration and the secure knowledge that they had weathered their first major test as a married couple. As they drove back to Kensington Palace together, holding hands and catching up on the 1,000 small details that couldn't be communicated in phone calls and letters, both Catherine and William understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The deployment had been difficult, but it had also been a gift, an opportunity to prove that their love was strong enough to survive anything life might throw at them. The tears they had shed during their goodbye had been tears of sadness and fear, but also of love so deep that separation felt almost unbearable. Now, reunited and stronger than ever, they understood that those tears had been necessary, that the goodbye without words had said everything that needed to be said. They had learned that love doesn't always require physical presence to sustain it, that sometimes the most powerful declarations of devotion happen in silence, and that true partnership means supporting each other's duty and service even when it requires personal sacrifice. Their story became an inspiration to other military couples facing similar separations, proof that love could survive and even thrive despite the challenges of service life. But for Catherine and William, the most important lesson was simpler and more personal, that they had chosen correctly when they chose each other, that their bond was strong enough to weather any storm, and that sometimes the most meaningful goodbyes are the ones where hearts speak louder than words.